with us today. So welcome, everybody. I'm Kathleen Espinoza, so I'm a member of the leadership team of the League of Women Voters of Lafayette. I do have one piece of business I would like to begin with for the Lafayette League before I start with the formal introduction. And that is, this is, as I'm sure all of us are aware, the month of October 2021. And technically we are supposed to have our annual meeting in October, but the leadership team met last month, and given the extraordinary circumstances of COVID and the sort of slower pace that we've had over the past year and a half, we motioned and passed a motion and then got a guidance from the State League to postpone our annual meeting until February. So I wanted to give those members who are at the meeting today a heads up, and you will certainly hear from the leadership team in the next month or so. All right. So with that said, I am going to ask our audience to please mute your computer or technological device. There is, the chat is open at the bottom. So if, as we're going through, you'd like to ask a question, I, myself, and Christine Malloyd will be monitoring that, so that if when we have time at the end of the discussion, we can entertain some of those questions. So the purpose of tonight's event: Louisiana law requires all parish governing authorities post-decennial census to examine its apportionment plan to determine if there has been significant enough change that warrants an adoption of a new plan. The law further provides that the boundaries of any election district for a new plan shall contain whole election precincts. We've invited Mike Hefner here to give us his perspective on what this means for Louisiana, and specifically what this means for local jurisdictions. Mr. Hefner is uniquely qualified to give a firsthand account of how local jurisdictions approach this process. So Mike Hefner is Manager and Chief Demographer for Geographic Planning and Demographic Services. He is a licensed attorney, a practicing Louisiana notary public, and he served as an elected school board member for the Lafayette Parish School System for 21 years. Hefner has conducted hundreds of projects for both the private and public sector, primarily throughout the state of Louisiana. Hefner's public sector services include redistricting, school zone attendance modeling, feasibility analysis of public projects, transportation routing, street and address updates, and custom census counts. After the 1990 census, Hefner provided technical assistance services to some 22 governmental entities for reapportionment. With the release of the 2000 census, Hefner was primarily involved in analyzing population trends in connection with the reapportionment services to over 41 jurisdictions throughout Louisiana. For the 2010 census, Hefner successfully completed redistricting plans for over 73 jurisdictions. In this current post-2020 census period, Hefner is currently providing expertise and assistance to several governing authorities across the state. Thank you, Mike Hefner, for joining us. So I do want to introduce our panel moderator, Dr. Christine Malloyd. She is an associate professor of political science and associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her teaching and researching focus on state and local government, religion and politics, and civic education. Her forthcoming co-edited book with Pearson Cross, The Party is Over, The New Louisiana Politics, provides a comprehensive reassessment of Louisiana state politics from institutions to politics to policy. She serves as the Voter Services Chair for the League of Women Voters of Lafayette. So welcome, Mike and Christy. I'm going to throw the meeting over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity. Just a quick reminder, everybody, that we are recording. So anything that you say here or in the chat will be part of a public record. And we will share this video after the fact with on our league website as a resource to learn about the redistricting process. So thanks so much, Mike, for being here. I've had the pleasure of seeing you speak at a number of city and parish council meetings before, but it's nice to be able to meet with fellow friends who are excited about this kind of thing and really want to learn more. So I'd ask you just to start by giving us and our audience a bit of sense of what it is that you do as a demographer during a redistricting cycle.
Well, like Kathleen opened up with, after each census count, any jurisdiction that elects its representatives by district, by law, have to look at their new population counts for their existing districts and see if they're still within balance. And basically, you take the new census count. Let's just take a parish, for example. You take the parish count and you divide it by the number of seats of whether it's a jury, a council, school board, you divide by the number of seats. That gives you the average number of people per district. You have a plus or minus 5% leeway. If any of those districts, one or all of them, or if more, one or more have it, then, or outside that, then you have to go through the redistricting process. The redistricting process is basically adjusting the lines to take people in or out of an election district in order to get it closer to that average. And that goes back to the one man, one vote rule, that every person on that council, that jury, school board represents approximately the same number of people, and therefore their vote has an equal weight with all the others. So that's what it goes to. Of course, we have other complexities that come in with maintaining minority voting strength and those kinds of things. But that's the main thrust on redistricting.
So we know that we just went through a census period. We got new data about who's living where and all kinds of new numbers. We got it a little later this year than we might have liked. I imagine people in your position are sweating that a little bit.
It did not help anything, I tell you. For the first time in history, it was late. Okay, in 200 something years, it was late.
What's that process look like from you get new census data? How do you turn those raw numbers into usable maps?
Well, actually, by law, the Census Bureau has to release a file. It's called the PL for public law 94-171 file. It is specifically for redistricting. What it gives you is your total count, your total population, your voting age population, which is anyone that was 18 years of age and older as of April 1st, the year the census was taken. Doesn't necessarily mean they're registered to vote, it means they're eligible to register to vote. And then it gives the breakouts by race. That file is what every entity in the United States has to use by law, by the Voting Rights Act, and most of that is mirrored in the various state statutes that you have to use that particular census file. It gives us that data at the parish level, state level. It gives it down to the block groups, the census tract, census blocks, but primarily what we use for reapportionment or precincts. We use precincts and census blocks. A census block is the smallest geographic unit the census collects data for. And normally, like in town, that would be like a city block. Once you get in the rural areas, they're going to try to find boundaries that are composed of physical features that will allow you to actually be able to see where that particular boundary is. So we generally use that on parish level. Some of your larger municipalities, you try to use the precincts, whole precincts to the extent that you can. And if you have to split, then we use census blocks to split it.
So I know throughout the years, you have helped lots of local governments of various kinds do precinct mapping, but this is a special year with redistricting. Can you help us understand the difference between those kinds of the work that you do?
Yeah, there's two things. One of them is precinct management, which is what I do a lot for jurisdictions between the two census counts. Usually, let's kind of start at the beginning. Let's say we're going into a redistricting year right now. We're going to end up splitting some of these precincts. Now, if it's a parish governing authority, state statute specifies that whenever you split a precinct, let's say we split precinct 5, not 5 won't fit entirely in one district or another, so we got to divide it between two districts. So it becomes 5 and 5A. we have to create by ordinance for a parish governing authority. We got to create a new precinct out of that split. We'll normally name it like 5A. That then that may happen throughout the plan, but at the end, you're going to have a new set of precincts, your existing ones plus those that were divided. And that goes into effect. Now, normally in the third year after the census is released, what we call the precinct freeze lifts, which means that now we can change precinct boundaries. They get frozen at the end of December 31st of the year prior to the census. So in this case, it was 2019. They freeze those boundaries in because the census will tabulate the census counts by precinct. So they need to know what the boundaries are. Now, after that, after we do reapportionment, the state's going to be looking to try to minimize the number of those splits. So they allow us to try to merge these splits with an adjoining precinct that's in the same district, same DESI district, same congressional district, all the same jurisdictions, allows us to merge those two into one precinct. So that eliminates a set of commissioners and machines and cost. So because now they're all part of one precinct. They may still be voting at the same polling location, but they're in one precinct now. So that's what we call precinct management. Because those precincts are our building blocks, not only for creating the plan, but also for running an election. It's important to try to keep those squared away where they're nice, clean, and efficient. And some parishes do a better job of it than others.
I know a lot of us here in the Lafayette, we followed some of this work closely whenever you were doing precinct management when we had the recent charter amendment in 2018, the Lafayette charter, and we ended up with 2 split councils instead of 1 consolidated council. And I know you did some of that work.
Yeah, that was a rather interesting process. I wish I would have known the end game at the beginning. At first, I was just doing somebody a favor. I saw how far that got me. But, and then when you don't get communication with them because it's not formally set up, they changed precincts. They did some precinct mergers, did away with what we call alpha splits precincts, where a precinct geographically is the same, but it's split by alphabet. Might be A through M is one precinct, and the other one, anybody whose last name starts with an N through a Z is in another one. That's what we call an XYZ precinct. They got rid of some of those, but they never came in and updated the written, tell me or themselves to update the written descriptions. So we had 2018 precincts describing districts with the 2019 plan going into effect. So it wasn't well done.
Yeah.
But anyway. And then, of course, you probably have seen maybe some stuff on the news, the legislature, in an effort to try to reduce the number of precincts, because it costs them a lot of money and it costs local jurisdictions a lot of money. They allowed jurisdictions, parish governments, to create a new set of precincts, a clean set of precincts that were unfettered by jurisdictional issues that we would use for reapportionment. So there'd be larger precincts that we would end up then dividing as necessary to balance out the population. And the idea was that would go into effect in January of 2021. We'd use them for reapportionment. We'd finish reapportionment by early summer, and those new precincts would go in effect in 2021, the fall of 2021. Secretary of State said 2021 was going to be an off-election year. There weren't going to be any elections on those. Well, I don't think anybody in 2019 knew about COVID or a pandemic, or that the first time in 200-something years we'd have a delay in the census count. So we're ending up now, because of the constitutional amendments that the legislature put on the fall ballot for 21, and then there's some that do have local issues. We're having to use a set of precincts that wasn't designed to have an election run on them. So some of the voters will be inconvenienced. But the good thing is, a lot of those parishes I dealt with doing that, we're in the middle of reapportionment now. So once we finish that here in the next couple of 2 or 3 months, we'll have a really good, clean set of precincts in place for 2022. So anyway, yeah, that's another part of it.
As you've been looking at the new census data, are there any particular issues or trends or challenges that you've noticed for the remapping process for Lafayette or surrounding Acadiana parishes this year?
Yes. So first thing I was concerned about was the response rate. Because of COVID, they were not able to send census takers out in the community to follow up on non-respondents to the census forms that were mailed out. They keep track what household responded, which ones didn't. Well, they didn't send them out in the field very much because of the COVID. So anybody that didn't fill out a form didn't get a knock on their door either to get that data. So I think some were missed on that. But I think some of that was offset by the new method they allowed this time around, which would have been been able to do it by electronic, your phone, computer, your laptop, tablet, whatever. So you could actually respond to that electronically. And I think that helped make up for the difference. I know I did it, and it was a very simple way to do it. So they probably got more response rate on that, but they probably lost some on the other end. Aside from that, Louisiana did about the same, 65% response rate in 2010, about same thing in 2020. That means 65 out of every 100 households that were sent a form responded. So we're only counting 65% of our population. Some of the parishes I deal with have ranged anywhere from a 60, 61% response rate. I think Lafayette was at 62. There's some that had a 39% response rate. Tensas has it worse in the state, 39%. Okay, 39 out of 100. All right, we got counted. Well, that's not helping anything. Probably saw on the news, Generette, their numbers fell below 5,000. So technically they're now a town, not a city. And I think some of that is just, well, first of all, some of it is trends. Some of it is just response rate. But by and large, I don't think I've seen anybody vary much more than 4 or 5% on their response rate. Some are almost identical to 2010. So setting that aside, what I have been seeing, though, is a major change in minority concentration, minority populations. Some of them are trends that I've been tracking since the 1990 census. And unfortunately, the trend hasn't abated on some of those. That affects how we're able to draw majority minority districts to maintain minority voting strength. And in some areas, there is no way to be able to recreate one of their majority minority districts. I've got a couple of about 3 or 4 parishes right now where they may have had 2 or more, now going to lose one. And we're having discussions with them on how do you want to do it. Our neighbor to the east, St. Martin, is a good example. St. Martin Parish. They had 2 majority minority districts in St. Martinville, 1 up in Breaux Bridge. Well, since the 1990 census, those 2 in St. Martinville have been losing percentages. And now if I equally split them, even with a 7% deviation, minus 7% deviation, they're going to be in the upper 40s. In 2010, with a 8% deviation, minus 8% deviation, we're able to keep them about 57. So now they're going to have to make a decision. Do we have one strong one and one swing district, or do we split them equally? And that's what I'm trying to get input from the community on, because it's a community's plan. It's not my plan. Part of that, though, is shifts related to jobs. A lot of that, though, is that more and more neighborhoods are becoming desegregated. You're getting more mixed race families moving into neighborhoods that traditionally have been single race, whether it's traditionally majority Black or majority white. They're mixing now. Plus you have more people responding as a mixed race, not a single race. Instead of responding Black, they may put, well, I'm white and Black, white, Black, and American Indian, those kinds of things. So you're starting to see more mixed race respondents with the census. So that tends to affect those numbers as well.
This is, I'm going to draw in one of our audience questions because I think it relates to this point from Christy Green. This is the first redistricting session since the Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court decision. So
that's correct.
It used to be the case that we would go through these redistricting and reapportionment processes, and then at least for mostly southern states with a history of discrimination, the courts would be involved in that process. And now that's less the case. And there are, a lot of technical details I'm glossing over there, but can you speak a little bit about what you see that might be different, since this is the first reapportionment cycle since that Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, from my standpoint, the thing that it helps the most on is a timeline for adoption, because normally I have to plan out a 120-day window for a Section 5 pre-clearance application. They get 60 days, and they reserve the right to have an additional 60 days to review if they need to. So I generally, on the calendar, my work calendar for a client, I got to factor in 120 days. Right now, we don't. I know when the Supreme Court found that the formula that identified what jurisdictions had to submit to the Justice Department for review was antiquated. It hadn't been updated, found it unconstitutional. And with that, since there was no formula in Section 4 to say who had to have pre-clearance, then nobody gets pre-clearance. Pre-clearance is done under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, a lot of people thought, well, that was the end of the democracy. And actually, that I don't find that to be the case at all. Just because you don't have a review doesn't mean that you can just do anything you want willy-nilly. You still have to follow the criteria of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that's all Section 5 did. If you were covered jurisdiction, any change in your election scheme was presumed to be in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act unless you proved otherwise. That's basically what the Section 5 process was. So you put all this data together, you send it to them, and they examine it. And if they say, well, we can't find where you violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, so we're going to go ahead and pre-clear your plan to put into effect. And that's where we get the pre-clearance letter. I still, and I tell all my clients this, just because we don't have at this point in time a Section 5 pre-clearance requirement, we still have to follow Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. There's not going to be a plan that I'm going to be advocating for them that's going to violate that. Actually, I still use the same analysis that Section 5 attorneys did for all the plans that I've sent up in the past. I use that same analysis. I mean, I've been doing it for so long. Part of my job is to try to make those plans as bulletproof as I can. I want to make sure that they meet all the criteria of Section 2. We do have some state criteria, though, that has to be followed. But by and large, the Section 5 was just mostly making sure you followed Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. They didn't care about state law. They just cared about the federal law. So for me, the biggest difference is just the timeline and the amount of work it took to put together a plan package to send to them so that they could do all the analysis on their end and not have to be missing any information. I used to send, I mean, there was a lot of data, but I want to give them all the data they need. So I don't see, for me, for my clients, it's not a big deal. I can't speak for others on what they may be doing, but we're still going to be doing it. It's people's plan and it needs to be done in the right way.
So help us understand the process. You are hired by a governing authority to help draw the maps. Once you have worked with the data, you've drawn the maps up, then what happens? What are the next stages in these processes?
I do mine a little differently. There's not too many demographers in the state that do it. But out of those that do it, I do mine a little differently. My preferred way is to do it through what I call redistricting workshops. The first thing I do is a determination. A determination is where we take the new census and apply it to the current districts to see if any are out of balance. If any are out of balance, then I write them a memo saying, these are your new populations, these are your percentages, these are the ones that are out of balance. And also, state law requires them to have if it's a board, school board, they have to have a resolution stating that. If it's a municipality or a parish governing authority, then they have to have an ordinance. So I usually draft those so that they can get that little bit of housekeeping out of the way. It's just a public formal statement that we did the calculations according to 33-14-11, and we do have to redistrict, or we don't have to redistrict, and they adopt that. All right, first thing we do if they have to redistrict is I will go through and do a lot of modeling on their plans to get a feel for the demographics. I'll usually come up with a starting plan that meets all the Section 2 criteria, but that's all it is, starting plan. We'll have this workshop. It's kind of like a retreat. It's open to the public. I encourage the public to attend when I do have them. But I go through it district by district, kind of show them these are the changes, generally speaking, that we're going to have to do. We got these districts that are high, these districts that are low. The lines are going to have to move in a general direction in order to balance them. Because those representatives work in the communities, they've been representing them, they have a pretty good feel for what communities kind of belong together and which ones, what areas are more appropriate. So what I do is I bring my software and we actually do the modeling during the session. If I'm working with District 3 and District 3 says, look, this subdivision here really more identifies with District 3 than it would District 5. What happens if you put that in? So I'll click on those census blocks or that voting precinct and see what it does to the numbers. They'll see, because I show them, these are the numbers you got to look for. If that percentage is out, then if you want to keep that, then we've got to go offset it somewhere else. So they actually become part of the planning process. And the public does too. The public can say, look, what happens if you move the line from here to there? Well, let's see what it does. And so we'll click on it and we'll see what the numbers are. At the end of the process, you'll be able to have a good feel as to the distribution of your population, the racial demographics of your population, and generally speaking, you'll understand why the plan ends up looking the way it does. Why is a boundary here instead of there? And I just find that it really brings in a lot more trust when you follow that process. When you haven't followed that process, then that's usually when you run in my opinion, when you run into a whole lot of issues. And like I said, it's a people's plan. While that jurisdiction has to approve it, adopt it, it's not for them personally, it's for the people of that jurisdiction. And I take that, I'm very passionate about that, because that's how the people are going to elect their representatives for the next 10 years.
Obviously, you're considering geography whenever you're doing this mapping, and you don't want a district or that's places over here and places over here with a thin line or something connecting them. What other kinds of things are you thinking about? Race, ethnicity, cultural traditions, economic traditions? What else is going into thinking about how you make a district?
Well, they need to be as compact as possible, so geographically compact. They need to be contiguous. They got to be one piece, not multiple pieces. You want to try to keep your communities of interest together. That may be your smaller communities. If you can avoid it, you don't want to split them up between multiple districts, because that weakens their voice. They're no longer a sufficient number to have the attention of that representative. So those are some of the things that we will take a look at. The geography, though, it's a geography and numbers situation. Sometimes you have census blocks and they cause us some heartburn. We can't change census block boundaries. You may have a census block, particularly in a rural area, or even sometimes in a smaller community, where you might be dealing with a district that might need average district size 2,500, and you got one census block that's got 990 people in it. Okay, and you're trying to balance it out, and it's just sometimes it causes some real big issues, because you have a census block boundary that really, and population that doesn't really fit very well. Sometimes you have precinct boundaries that don't fit terribly well, but generally those are a little easier to deal with because we can split them. But I guess that's the biggest thing. And I'm seeing it now, we touched on what I've been seeing with the minority population. You're clicking on these small census tabulation blocks and you're finding that now you might have 55% Black, 45% white, or vice versa, whereas it might have been in the past, might have been 75, 80% Black. And so now you're having to try to put together a configuration that gives them a viable majority minority district, but sometimes the numbers in the geography aren't working too well. And you can't gerrymander, as you said. Now, gerrymander is a real loose term. I hear that all the time. But gerrymander basically is, you can't, while you got to be cognizant of race, can't be the sole criteria. You can't forget all these other things you have to do under Section 2, compact, contiguous, communities of interest, change the districts as little as possible, protection of incumbents, those things, one man, one vote. You can't throw those out the window just because you want to get your minority numbers up. You can't take a core area and run down the right of way of a highway, pick up another little community and go down a river and pick up another little community where it looks like a spider vein. You can't do that. That would probably invite a challenge.
Other than race, what are some of the ways that communities of interest are defined?
Usually, one of the things we look at besides a formal municipality like a village, a town, or a city, I generally will look at census designated places. They're not a formal community in that they have specific boundaries and a council and all that, but the Census Bureau identifies that area as those people having common interests together. And so they'll create what we call a census designated place. In Lafayette Parish, Milton, for example, is a census designated place. It's not a formal municipality, but that's usually one of the things we look at. Some of these large developments now that you're seeing all around the state, we try to keep those together and try not to split them up where you have district lines cutting through them. Depending on the situation, though, sometimes you can't help it. Like I'm working with Central Community Schools right now. They have several very large developments, and that's a relatively small geographic area. It's dense, but sometimes you can't help but having to split it. So then it becomes where's the most appropriate place to split it.
You had mentioned earlier that that census blocks are these really small units that are almost drawn down to a literal city block. Mm-hmm. Who gets to draw those lines? You said sometimes you're frustrated by them, so you're not the person drawing the census block. Who does that? Census
Bureau. They'll ask our input on census tracts. They'll ask our input on census block groups. But when it comes to census blocks, it's like, hands off, that's for us to do. And the hierarchy, just so everybody understands, the census block is the smallest geographic unit, but when you group census blocks together, that becomes a block group. So it's a little bit larger, it's more regional. When you group block groups together, those become a census tract. And then when you group census tracts together, that becomes a parish. And then when you group parishes together, that becomes a state. So that's the hierarchy on your census data. So you can break it down all the way from the United States down to state, parish, tract, block group, and block. And then in the middle of that, all that is precincts, which we use for elections.
One of the points that you mentioned that you have to take into consideration among geography and compactness is protection of incumbents.
Could you like that? Huh? Caught you here.
I mean, I know certain politicians love that, but could you help us understand a little bit? It sounds like it might not be fair.
That comes up a little bit. Like, what do you mean? They get special consideration on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? Mm-hmm. But that's not actually what the intent was. What happened was after the first version of the Voting Rights Act went into effect and they started having some redistricting following that, creating majority minority districts. Well, some jurisdictions around the country started saying, we can actually use redistricting to redistrict some of these minority representatives out of their district. and put them in a white district instead of majority black district or majority minority district. And so they were using it for nefarious ways, and subsequent court challenges and also subsequent Voting Rights Act legislation said, no, you cannot use redistricting to deliberately move incumbents from one district to the other. Now, you know, some of them like to do it politically. If they have somebody they don't necessarily like on their council or their jury, they would love to do that. But generally, we will not allow that to happen if we can. Now, sometimes it makes for an awkward boundary when you're trying to, you got to come in and make sure you keep that incumbent in there. And then sometimes the numbers won't work any other way other than a district that has two incumbents in the same one. But if we can avoid it, we do, because that's what Section 2 says, and that's what we're going to do. But yeah, it's not for special protection for those that are already elected.
We've talked about the, you know, the local level districts that you might be drawing, but there are also a lot of regional districts, and some of them are very specialized, things like the Public Service Commission. There are all of these lower level judicial districts, Supreme Court districts, which it's really hard for people to figure out, like, yeah, well, how do you think about how to draw those? Because it's not as obvious as a parish level district.
But it works the same way. All we're doing is we're just taking in a larger area. They'll start probably at the parish level on some of these. And then from there, they'll start dividing parishes up by precincts. And then where they can, they try to put them where they can fit. Now, they're not allowed to split precincts. They have to use whole precincts. Okay, so the existing ones that came with the 2020 census, for example, that set of precincts, that's what they have to use. But they have a much larger geography to work from than, say, a parish or a municipality. But they'll generally start at parish, then they go down to voting precincts, and they're going to pick and choose which ones fit their numbers and fit the demographic profile that they're looking for. Now, in the past, because so many parishes had a lot of small precincts left over from reapportionment, a lot of times they would assign these little small precincts to like one Bessie district, and then the other one next to it be to another Bessie district. They're fine tuning their plan, just like I use census blocks at the precinct level to fine tune my plan. It's just a little bit larger geography. That, when they do that, though, that keeps us from being able to merge those precincts later on our precinct management part. So those little small ones stay forever, and it's expensive. It costs the same to run a 2,000 voter precinct as it does a 50 voter precinct. So you want to try to get rid of them. That's why the Secretary of State allowed us to set up those 2021 prospective precincts, try to get rid of all those, because now everybody's got to reapportion. There's no jurisdictional boundaries to deal with, so we can start clean. And it's working. The ones that I've been working with so far, it's going to save them a lot of money. On some of them, I'm looking at parish level, probably they're going to save $30,000 to $40,000 per election, not per election, sorry, per election. And if it's a state that's cost sharing it, then it's going to save the state money. If it's stuff that's being done on a local level, it's going to save on the local level. And at the end, the taxpayers pay less for election services and they pay more for services in other areas that they need it. But it's and they're going through it right now on the regional level with your Bessie, PSC, and all that. And of course, congressional. That's usually where you get a lot of the conversations going on. And it's going to be interesting to see with the hurricanes and the population shifts and all that. It's going to be real interesting to see. I saw a lot of it with 2010 on the coastal areas. Some of them really gave me a lot of fits trying to rebalance that population shift. But yeah. I don't do the state stuff. I let them play with that.
Yeah, that's between, having potentially a little lower response rate with the census, and then everything following Laura and Delta. We saw some pretty major shifts in Southwest Louisiana, And many of the rural parts, we saw a lot of depopulation, I know. So,
And you had those storms coming through during the time that they were collecting census data. So you're not apt to think about filling out your census form when you're trying to get out of the way of a hurricane.
yeah.
So that was some issues that were brought up as well.
So if voters are have questions or concerns about the redistricting process, the reapportionment process, who's the appropriate group to take those concerns to?
Well, every jurisdiction is going to have a body that's in charge, and that body is going to have a chairman, a president, in charge of it. That would be who I would end up going to. For example, if it's a parish council, and you want to be involved, I'd get in touch with parish government offices and say, hey, please send me a notice when you're going to have your meetings. Or I have these concerns, I'd like to have them expressed. When can I do that? Just like any other participation on an issue that might be of concern. It's basically the same thing. It's all public meetings. They should be all public meetings. Some demographers do these things, meeting with individual members. And so you don't necessarily, as a public, you don't necessarily see the sausage being made. You kind of see it after it's being made or after it's made. I don't like doing it that way because, number one, when you move one district, you're bumping into somebody else and then you end up chasing your tail. Why'd you move my district line? Oh, well, the one I met with you before, we had to move his line for whatever reason. Well, I don't like that. I want it somewhere else. That's what you run into. I like doing it in public. Everybody there and the public being there. And most of them that do it at some point, they're going to have a public hearing. And that, if you haven't been able to participate before, be sure and show up for that public hearing. And if you have ideas or you don't like it, then you need to express it. I've had public hearings where we've had the public make some suggestions. They didn't participate in any of the workshops, but they came and said, well, I have a question. What happens if we do this? And I'll bring my software. We look at it right there. All right, if I put that line over, this is what it does to the numbers. The council looked at that earlier. That's why we don't have it, because it threw the numbers way off. Or some of them actually come up with a good idea. And it's like, does the council want to accept that change? Yeah, we'll accept that change, but then it becomes part of the final plan that goes to adoption. So yeah, the public can have a good input, but they also need to understand there are some limitations of what we can and can't do.
Sure. I want to remind everybody who's on the call that if you have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat, or if you prefer coming on, you're able to do that as well. I'm going to throw you what might be a softball question, but I've always been interested in this. How does one become a demographer? What did you study?
Actually, well, I graduated from USL with a degree in business administration, but my major was marketing, which is demographics, and involved in various things over the years. It was very actively, professionally involved in economic development for a good while. That's also demographics. But I really got into the census stuff when I was with the planning district. I went to work for them right after the 1990 census was released. And we have 7 of them that are around the state, and that's census data center affiliates. Basically, that's your regional census data warehouse. So I was working with a lot of census data. Well, 1990 is when the census came out with for the first time, everything's electronic. Before that, it was the big white books. And we had stacks and stacks of books, and you had to go look it all up. Now it's all electronic. Problem is, you needed mainframe computer to read the files. Well, myself and my counterpart with the planning district in Lake Charles, we took a CAD/CAM program, a shareware CAD/CAM program, and rewrote it. So instead of reading XY coordinates, it read the Census Bureau's latitude, longitude coordinates, which allowed us to create polygons and then associate the data from each of the polygons to that polygon, so that we actually could build the maps on a PC running at 25 megahertz with a 40 gigabyte hard drive. So that's actually how we started doing it electronically. We just kind of winged it. Now, of course, later they came out with commercial software, which is far more powerful. But that's how we actually started doing it. That's the ones that Kathleen mentioned about the technical assistance. We weren't necessarily into doing redistricting, but I was doing it for the city engineers, parish engineers, and others that were typically assigned to come up with a reapportionment plan. They'd come over to our place. We'd work through all the plans and we'd send it with them. They'd come back and say, well, they like it, except they want to change this and they want to change that. So
That's fascinating. It's really amazing to think how far we have come in terms of
yes,
that
yes.
technological advance. Couple of questions coming in from many of our audience members. We haven't talked, even though this is very much a political process, we haven't talked very much about political parties per se. How much does political party affiliation go into thinking about these issues as you're drawing these districts and thinking about things like protection of incumbents?
Statewide and your statewide offices, it's one of their key things that they look at. At my level, at the parish level, we rarely ever look at that. I can't remember the last time that they asked me to pull up the party affiliations, because it's just, it's just not a real big factor at the local level. But on statewide, it is. And you're going to be seeing that all around the country. And that's why most people are getting involved in it, because they want to make sure that whatever's drawn is drawn fairly.
Thank you. Another question revolves around the precinct and poll location changes that were made just before the census happened. You had mentioned earlier that
yes,
in 2019, just before the census started, there were some changes. Could you go into a little more detail about that and
sure,
how that works?
Yeah, some of the parishes that I was doing a lot of the precinct management with, we were having issues with a lot of these little small precincts that we couldn't merge because they were in different jurisdictions. And we had several of the state changed some of their interpretation of the statute, where we had some parishes that had some precincts that had boundaries that were no longer in compliance. So we would have to change those boundaries. Secretary of State at the time said, well, look, while you're doing this, the legislature passed this legislation in 2018 to allow us to create a clean set of precincts to use for redistricting purposes, starting in 2021. Would you talk to your parish clients about that? And I did, and I think it was a really good idea. What we did is we created a new set of precincts that were larger, that some of them were intended to be purposely split, but I wanted to be able to choose the most appropriate way to split it instead of being confined by the fact that we already have 2 or 3 small precincts here. They're not fitting quite right, so I got to create another small precinct. Now I have a larger precinct that I can make one cut, put one in one district and one in the other district. So now you have one precinct becomes 2 instead of 5 or 6. Because you have the little small ones in there, plus when you got to split it, because you can't split it where you want it, creates another small sliver with maybe 30 or 40 people in it. Every one of those has to have a set of commissioners. Now, the thing was in 2019, we figured we'd get our data at the end of February, beginning of March, like usual. And by early summer, we'd be finished with the parish governing authority redistricting, because they're the ones that are in control of precincts. So we would have split a lot of these, assigned polling locations, and we'd be done with it, be all over with. Well, it turned out that in most of the parishes, when we did the 2019s, those files, those boundaries were sent to the Census Bureau. That's what they collected the data for in those parishes. Well, the clerk is usually the one that goes through and makes recommendations for the polling locations for each of those precincts. They make those recommendations to the parish governing authority, who has the authority to either accept, reject, or modify that. It's their responsibility to approve that. But none of the clerks did it. Didn't find that out until like the end of April of this year. The Secretary of State was saying, hey, we need polling locations because we're going to have an election because of these constitutional amendments. Well, it had never gotten done during 2020. That was their normal job. I jumped in to try to help identify which ones would be the most appropriate. Keeping in mind that these precincts in 2019 were never meant to have an election on them. They were going to be divided up, smaller units, and more polling locations being used. But with the delay with COVID, that's exactly what caused it. We weren't able to do all that. And so now we have a set of precincts for this one election. We have to use a set of precincts that's not really optimized. So some voters will be inconvenienced, but then again, they have a longer period now to do early voting. They can do mail, they can press their mail-in ballots. So there's other ways to do it. It's not like the old days where you had to drive over to a polling location. That was about it. So there are ways to help mitigate it, but it's not optimal. Now, we can only have one polling location assigned to one precinct. Now, some polling locations have multiple precincts. We call that a consolidated precinct. So you may have a school that might have 3 precincts voting at that location. You go in, I'm precinct 5. So I go to the precinct 5 table. There might be precinct 8 table, and there might be a precinct 10 table. So you go to the precinct that you had, or the table that you want. But you have one polling location that's serving 3 precincts. So not every precinct geographically has a polling location in it. And that was one of the things I worked with. Some of the clerks were good about working it, and we came up with some pretty good stuff. Not ideal, but some it's like, I don't want to get involved in that. That's too political. So usually myself and the registrar end up having to do some of those recommendations based on the best geographic location. I don't normally recommend them because I can't keep up with what's the most appropriate polling location, because there's a lot of things that go into it. Parking, handicap access, outlets for machines, electrical outlets, size, issues if it's at a school and it's on a Tuesday, how you handle school security. Do you want it at a school or not? A lot of things like that. And I cover about 1/3 of the state, so I can't keep up with everybody's polling location. So I don't do that. I do the geographic boundaries, but the rest of it I have to leave to the ones that are in charge, which is the clerk of courts. And that's how elections work, is that once we do a plan, it gets implemented through the Secretary of State and the errand voting system. The registrars are responsible for assigning voters to the proper precinct, proper districts. The clerks are in charge of conducting the elections. They run the elections. So those are your 3 layers that you have to work with, and everybody has a specific responsibility.
Makes sense.
I hope that answered it, because I know that there's been a lot of questions on it, and it's caused me a great deal of anxiety since April, when I found all this was coming down. So
Sure. Well, I certainly appreciate your time speaking to us about this and about so much else. I know I speak on my own behalf, but a lot of people here are my fellow nerds in learning more about these kinds of things. So it's exciting to be able to take a deep dive with someone who knows a lot and is really passionate about the work.
Well, I appreciate it. Sometimes it doesn't always go the way you want. These precincts for redistricting is kind of an example, but once we're finished with the process, and that's what I've been telling some of my elected officials in the public, let me finish the process, because once we finish with it, it's going to work very, very well. And voters will have some of these polling locations not being used for this election cycle will be used once we get the new set of precincts in. But you want a good, clean plan, good set of precincts, so you minimize voter confusion. But before we go, let me just touch on one thing. You mentioned Supreme Court redistricting. Some people may wonder, do judicial districts have to redistrict? They do not. They are considered to be non-representative positions. They don't represent people. They're just used for residential purposes, essentially. So they don't have to redistrict every 10 years. So you have a lot of these sub-districts now in some of these jurisdictions that were created in 1994 using 1993 precincts. And those precincts have all changed. A lot of them have changed from successive redistricting and mergers and consolidations. And so now you got some of them now that are just little slivers of their former precincts. They might have 3 to 5 people in them. So that's one thing I'm hoping that at some point the legislature is going to allow us to look at readjusting them to the nearest precinct boundary, because I've done some modeling on some of them, and we can do that without jeopardizing minority voting strength in those judicial districts. But that is a headache. They can't, people didn't have the GIS like they do now, so it's hard to find maps. I've been recreating them to the extent that I can, but it's difficult. But that's why you don't see your justice of the peace and your judicial districts being redistricted during this time.
It's helpful. I think we have just one last question before we jump off. And Christy Green, I think, had a question about the Public Service Commission districts.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hafner, Christy Malloy mentioned we're kind of nerdy about this stuff, and I've been particularly nerdy about the Public Service Commission, which I admit to knowing very little about. But given that we're having all this infrastructure spending and possible shifts to renewable energy and broadband and stuff, is that going to be an interesting commission? You mentioned it's at the state level. Where could one go to look into that? And particularly looking at District 2, I noticed that Lafayette Parish and part of St. Martin are in District 2. And I think Iberia is, but that we protrude into District 4, and Iberia is split between 2 and 4. So I just wonder what's happening with the PSCs and if there's anything to follow there.
Well, they're just getting that state level stuff started right now. They're working on congressional and legislative, but they're going to then be going into the BESI and the PSC. So I would probably get in touch with the chairman of the Public Service Commission and see what their calendar is for their redistricting. All this stuff, all this is done legislatively or by each of their bodies. So eventually a lot of this ends up in the legislature. And so you definitely want to follow the bills as to which plan, because a lot of times there's competing plans. I know I've been asked to draw some plans by legislators in the past because they didn't like the direction that they were going. So I've done state level, but not on an official basis. But yeah, you want to kind of keep an eye on it, because unfortunately they usually start in New Orleans on their stuff, and they take care of New Orleans. And then by the time they get out to our part of the state, mid-state and whatnot, they're starting to break up a lot of these communities. And that's one reason why I was encouraging some of my clients to do the redistricting precincts, because we don't have those little small precincts right now that they can come in and nibble at and split up a community between different regional districts. They got to use those same big districts, but they don't have the opportunity to split them. So it actually, when I was drawing them, was actually long-term thinking that I want to be able to keep these communities of interest together. So when the state does theirs, they're not coming in and cutting them all up where it minimizes the voice of those people. So you do want to keep an eye on it. And if you're interested in the PSC, I'd get in touch with them and find out just what their calendar is on doing that and when they're going to have their meetings, because they will be having some input into it.
Thank you.
But you're gonna have your House and Senate bills 1 coming up probably in the next session, which is going to be your congressional districts, and then also your they'll be setting their House districts and their Senate districts, and then you'll have the legislation for the BESI, and then you'll have the legislation for the PSC. But all those people are going to probably have some input into it, so you might as well have input too.
Thank you.
I think we had one last question come in from Pearson Cross. Pearson, did you want to come on and ask that?
Sure. Thank you. I'm enjoying it. Mike, really appreciate you spending your time. Listen,
Anytime, Pearson.
Thank you. I heard, thanks for coming. I heard you say apportionment, and I got into the talk just a little bit late. So normally when I think about apportionment, I think about, Congress doling out so many seats per state. Louisiana gets 7, then it gets 6, or California gets 2 more, or Texas does. But I was curious what apportionment means in Louisiana, given that most of the districts we elect people in are single member districts. So we're not actually awarding more seats, are we? How are you using the term apportionment?
Well, actually, technically, and this all y'all that are nerds about this, y'all probably be the only ones at the next get together that'll know this. But you hear the terms reapportionment and redistricting. Okay. Technically, reapportionment is for your congressional districts and your congressional districts only. And that goes from the Constitution. The population of country shall be apportioned among the population. Congress sets the number of seats. So they take the number of seats and they divide that into the new population. That tells you how many people each seat has to represent. Now, when you start losing population, then you don't have enough for a seat, and that's when you lose a seat. That's what's happened a while back. Now, redistricting is what we refer to everything that's non-congressional. State, House, state Senate, Bessie, parish, school board, municipality. The process, though, is the same. You set it up according to population per seat. Most of them, like Pearson mentioned, are single member seats. So that district's represented by a single member, and it's supposed to represent its equal share of the population. But the term reapportionment, redistricting is used interchangeably. It's even in legislation, it's used interchangeably. But that's the actual technical definition. Reapportionment is congressional, everything else is redistricting. There was another point that I wanted to bring out, and it's fleeting at the moment. Dual member districts. Yeah, I'm starting to have some new clients that I've picked up that I haven't done their redistricting in the past, and they actually have a combination of dual member seats and single member seats. And so I've done my research on that, and actually it is allowed, but a dual member district will represent twice the number of people that a single member district will. So, but we do the determination by seat, not by district. So it's an interesting, I've come across all kind of configurations on election schemes. It's very, very interesting to see how they come up with it and how they work. And some of them, it really works pretty well. So it's another thing I've added to my library. It's a different way to do it.
Yeah.
And I got municipalities now, like Scott, they had me over there to talk about going from single member districts at large. I have others that do it at large. They want to go to single member districts or a combination dual and single member districts. So, what works for some may not work for the other. It's all really depends on the community.
I was watching a live stream of the Youngsville City Council meeting where your name was invoked several times, Mike, in your absence, as they were considering the potential of moving to districts away.
They've made 2 or 3 starts at it over the years. The problem is that all their incumbents lived in the core of Youngsville. So it was hard to create the districts without incumbents running against each other, and they're not going to want to do that. So it's something we may end up taking another look at just for their own use. I've had some that said, look, we have 4 single member districts and they're not large. How about if we do 2 single member districts and the rest at large? We think it'll attract more qualified people. Well, we did it, set it up, and I'll be honest with you, I've been following them since that 2012 period, and it's been chaos. It's just not working for that community, Others it might, Before we go, I posted, because one of the questions that Kathleen had sent to me was, where can we get some idea of software, or how can we read these census files? There's a Ballotpedia link that I posted on there that has a list of different, most of it's web-based reapportionment software that you can use. It's not necessarily the easiest to use, but it can be it can be used if you want to kind of start getting a feel for it. A lot of them are set up for statewide congressional redistricting, but you can do your parish level things with it. Municipality is going to be a little bit harder because you got to carve out those census blocks for a municipality. But I have worked with some folks that have been trying to learn it. It is a steep learning curve, but it's pretty cool once you get a hang of it, playing with it and see how the numbers work.
It's a lot easier than going to this big, thick census books and trying to put it on a mainframe computer.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're doing site location analysis for some major corporations and things like that because we had all that electronically. It was a lot easier to do it.
Well, Mike, I appreciate your time so much, and thank you for being with us this evening and giving us a peek into your world.
Sure. I see we got a question whether the third district's going to have to cede turf to 4 and 5.
Oh, yes.
I really don't know right now. I've been seeing so many population shifts though in some of these parishes. I'm working up at one up in North Louisiana. It's had a huge population shift. I mean, they've grew so much in one part of the parish, they can literally create their own district out of the growth. And now they're thinking, well, can we do that? Yeah, you can. All you got to do is by ordinance. But yeah, it's hard until you actually start pulling the numbers together. It's really hard to say who all is giving territory to who. But a lot of North Louisiana in general has lost population. You have some hot spots like Bossier, for example, that have gained a lot, but a lot of them around them have not. So South Louisiana has fared fairly well, but we've had a lot of shifts with hurricanes.
Sure. I think Lafayette's feeling the housing crunch and the rental market from that right now.
Yes, and it that affects patterns too. I'm seeing that like with Vermilion, Iberia, St. Martin, and St. Landry. Not only is the cost of construction higher in Lafayette, but also you have Metro Code, which is more stringent. So now I've been seeing over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people moving just outside of Lafayette, buying property. They get more property for the money, more house for the money, and they drive into Lafayette. So they're the bedroom communities. But you're also starting to see those corridors now starting to develop with services. Starting to see that now up through north of Karen Crow going out towards Sunset. And some of those municipalities are starting to recognize that trend, and they're starting to be a little more active on their economic development in those areas to develop those trends. But yeah, that all plays into housing patterns. They can move people. School districts can move people. There's people vote with their feet when they have the opportunity to do that. Job market. That's what's happened in St. Martin. Once they closed Fruit of the Loom in the mid-90s, a lot of those low to mid-scale jobs aren't there. So they're moving up to Brobridge, where they have more job opportunities. And so you're seeing a lot of shift there. And a lot of these parishes, I work with their student data as well. So I see in between the census, I see what's moving on their student data. That usually gives me a good idea what the general population is doing as well, because they come from the general population.
Well, it's fascinating work. I could easily imagine a different life where I could have gotten wrapped up in this kind of thing.
Well, you dream about it at night, particularly this time. This time of year, I'm dreaming about it every night.
Yeah, I do not envy your stress and anxiety through this process, but it's fascinating.
I love doing it. It's just I wish I had more days on the calendar to get all these meetings. Like I said, there's not too many demographers that do this. One retired, and a lot of her clients came over to me, and then we had another one that passed away. So some of those clients are looking for people. So we've been picking up additional work, and I like getting everybody's info out there all as quickly as I can. It's just, even though they have time. School board elections, municipal elections generally going to be in the fall of 22, parish governing authorities in the fall of 2023. That's the schedule this time, except for Lafayette Parish School Board, which will be in the fall of 2023. They're off cycle from everybody else. Now in 2030, when we get the data in 31, they'll have to have, the parish governing authorities will have an election that fall of 31. That's how the cycle falls. It'll be just like it was in 2011. So it's going to be mad dash in 31. Yeah, we'll only have like 3 to 4 months to develop the plans.
Wow.
we did in 2011.
Hopefully no additional global pandemics a decade from now.
Oh my Lord, yes. Oh, that was crazy. You know, you had your whole year planned out, and it's like, you're not going to get it in March. You might get it in April. Well, you're not going to get it in April. Maybe you're going to get it at the end of September. And then the ones that are on the first tier of getting that, those states, it's like, oh, they ain't no way you're going to wait till September. You're going to get it to us sooner. So they got it. We got ours August 12th. So it's been mad rush since. But I enjoy it. It is a lot of fun. You got to deal with some of the politics, but I'll be honest with you, when we do it in public, a lot of people are on good behavior, and it tends to flesh out some maybe personal agendas that they may have. And so it kind of tamps that down. We usually come out with a better plan when we get everybody involved in it.
That makes sense.
All right, let's see. See if there's anything else that we didn't. Let's see. Ida didn't figure because it was too recent. That is correct. Well, actually, the census locked down the data in October of last year. So Ida is not a factor. But we did have some storms, prior to that, which could have affected some areas.
Mike, I had a question, if you will indulge me. Earlier, I heard you say that there's actually majority minority districts are losing population because of reduced residential segregation. So people are leaving those all black or all white neighborhoods, and we're getting more mixed, which makes it harder to put together majority minority seats. So I'm wondering if something else you said would be helpful in that regard. Do you think that at-large districts could be an answer to the dilution of the majority minority districts you were talking about?
Probably not, because most of those at-large jurisdictions are going to be majority white. So it's going to be harder for minorities to elect a candidate of their choice. The DOJ Section 2 court cases generally try to disfavor at-large to the extent that they can. I've even thought about, like with dual member districts in the past, sometimes they've had dual members representing a minority district. So you'd have two sitting there, but the problem is you got to have double the number of people. And right now it's hard enough to get enough for a single member district, much less doubling that number. Mm-hmm. The only way it might work is if the larger geographic area that you need to get the double of the number, you might be able to bring in another minority community that you didn't have otherwise. You would have had to gerrymander to get to it.
What about a voting scheme where people could, only pick one candidate or sub-district or something like that?
Yeah, single shot. Yeah, those ballots. That might work in some circumstances. I don't know if it's going to work in the majority of those circumstances. You really just got to look at what the profile is. I was involved in a court case representing the state as a expert witness, and that was one of the things that the plaintiffs were looking at wanting to do. But when you ran the numbers and ran some models, it wasn't going to hold up. And one reason is that parish was also trending toward more desegregated housing patterns. And sure enough, the plan that they were advocating based on 2010, that would have given them a numerical majority minority, ran the numbers for 2020, and they dropped like 4 or 5%. So they were been in the high 40s. But the trends were telling you that when you analyze the trends. So it really just, it really depends on the jurisdiction. Most voters, though, they like the single member scheme because it's easy to understand. But others, the single shot ballots, those kind of things, they work okay for them. Or you pick out the 5 out of the 10 that are running, and you decide, whoever gets the most votes get it. Some municipalities in particular use that scheme.
Well, I think that brings us to a close for all of our questions, and really appreciate you staying on
anytime.
and hanging out with us.
Hey, anytime. And any of you that are in other parishes, I do most all the parishes around here as well as other parts of the state. So, please, if you see the notice for a redistricting workshop, come on by and sit in. It's a very interesting process.
Yeah, I can imagine a lot of people on this call coming just for fun.
Yeah, and I've taken it upon myself to invite the clerks and the registrars to some of these. In the past, they've tried to avoid them because they didn't want to get caught up in what they perceive to be politics. But I've noticed that the ones that have been coming and they understand the process, they have that fundamental understanding. I think it helps them do their jobs as well.
So that's a great point.
Just one more question. At those meetings and workshops, are people bad or good about wearing masks and socially distancing?
Well, right now with the mask mandate in there, they have to wear their mask, and they usually set up the rooms so that they're social distanced. Now, does everybody do it during the entire term or length of the workshop? It really varies. I've had some that they stuck to it the entire hour to 90 minutes. Others, if there weren't many people there, then they weren't around a lot of people, they took their mask off. So it really just depends. Most of these, they're not really heavily attended. And I've had to do student assignment plans in gyms to 500 or 600 parents. You do some of these, even in some parishes that they say that there's all this controversy, and you might have a dozen people show up. But if they're community leaders that show up, that's, at least that's who we need, so they can help get the word out. And in those areas where I'm having difficulties with the minority representation, I'm pulling them in. I mean, I'm actively pulling them in to have some sidebar meetings to show them what the demographics are. So they don't have to take my word for it. They can actually see it themselves. The numbers tell you, the numbers in the geography tell you what you need to do.
That's great. All right, I think we'll officially wrap up, and a big virtual round of applause, Mike.
Hey, I enjoy doing it. Always, I can talk all night on this.
We really appreciate that. And
If I'm not talking right now, I'll be clicking on maps, building plans out.
It's fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing your time with us.
Anytime.
Appreciate you.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
You too. Good night.
Night.